controversy. I noticed you put out a statement, I think, on the National Defense Bill, which came out of committee and is now supposed to come to the floor, I guess, tomorrow or Tuesday or something like that. What's the story with that?
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you to FBI for having me, and thank you, everyone, for coming out. I'll note you were referencing Tom and Mike. All three of us have the ignominious distinction of being Harvard lawyers, right. which I think both of them can convey, and it was certainly the truth whenever I was in West Texas and people found out I went to Harvard. The immediate response had to be, I've got a lot to apologize for. With respect to the NDAA, the Armed Services Committee in the Senate worked very hard on the bill. I think we came up with a good bill. It's not perfect, but it was a strong bill that had a lot of good elements. One of the elements of the current draft of the bill that I'm very proud of and that I fought very hard for concerned the victims of the terrorist attack at Fort Hood, where Nidal Hasan murdered 14 people, injured 31. And for a number of years now, the administration has characterized that attack as workplace violence instead of acknowledging it for what it was, which was a terrorist attack by a soldier who was in communications with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known terrorist, asking about jihad against American soldiers. And so the current draft of the NDAA has within it an amendment that I authored and introduced to provide that the victims of that shooting should be eligible for the Purple Heart. And that's something the administration has resisted. I was very proud to see that amendment adopted. It adopted unanimously. We saw support across the aisle come together despite resistance from the administration. Senators on both sides of the aisle agreed that it was more than enough time and we needed to recognize that. And there are lots of other provisions in the NDAA that are good and worthwhile. What we've seen happen at the end of the day is a typical example of what frustrates people with Washington, which is we took a bill authorizing our defense budget and it has now been hijacked into a lands bill. And at the last minute, some 70-odd different land provisions have been tacked on over 500 pages of legislation that was unfolded in the dark of night. Doesn't have a darn thing to do with our defense budget, with our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, or Marines. Has to do with a combination of, number one, congressional pork projects for different people, and number two, it takes, in the aggregate, north of 500,000 acres. It restricts their access, either takes it out of public use altogether or restricts the access of over 500,000 acres. And one of the things that I've done in the 2 years I've been in the Senate is it is my view there is far too much land in this country that is restricted from the public, restricted from the American people using and enjoying. And so I have been pressing quite vigorously that we should be looking to move more and more of our federal land out of federal ownership and into private hands so people can live on it, people can use it, people can enjoy it. And yet, because those bills haven't been able to get through on their merits, they're trying to attach it to must-pass legislation. And I think it's an abusive process and is wrong, and I think there are a lot of senators who are concerned about it.
And so what do you think will happen?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, listen, there is bipartisan blame for sticking this lands bill on. There are Republicans and Democrats in both the House and Senate that have their particular package or the other's particular package. And some of these, to be clear, some of these provisions may well be good. But they ought to be debated on and voted on in the merits. Some of them there are provisions in this that are opening up, for example, a copper mine in Arizona, other provisions opening them up to development, to use that are beneficial. But as is so common on Capitol Hill, you see log rolling of some good provisions rolled in with a big mess. So I don't know. I mean, it is my intention to do what I can to block it, because I think it is hijacking a bill that shouldn't be hijacked. Whether leadership is able to schedule it and force it through, that's going to depend on other moving parts right now.
And let's talk about the underlying issue there, which you've worked on hard for 2 years on Senate Armed Services Committee, which is the actual defense budget itself, the defense programs. What's your view of where we are? Do we need more? Do we need different? What's the situation with the defense budget?
Well, I think we certainly need different, and in all likelihood, we need more. You see a consistency when you talk to our commanders, our generals, our admirals, that the impact of sequestration is having a serious deleterious effect on our ability to defend our nation. Now, it's difficult sometimes to get a square answer to that because no one in this room will be surprised at the proposition that the defense budget is not immune from the world of congressional pork. And there are some projects that have more to do with a particular member's home district than the need to defend the national security interest of this country. There are also provisions. For example, we had a couple of hearings earlier this year focused on where I took the opportunity. We had one hearing in particular where Secretary Hagel, General Dempsey were testifying, and I asked them about the alternative fuels budget, about $7 billion altogether. One of the programs I focused on was the Navy's algae fuel program, a program to fuel ships using algae. Cost about $160 million. If we had used conventional fuel, it would have cost about $40 million. So it's $120 million, in my view, wasted to see how much we can run ships based on algae. The Air Force had a wind farm that they built up in Alaska. Unfortunately, they built it in an area where the wind doesn't blow. And so I raised these examples and said, look, in a time of austerity, in a time where, and this was, you had Secretary Hagel, you had General Dempsey talking about all of the burdens on protecting our nation that were coming from limited resources, I said, well, what about these programs? Why are we spending money on these programs? It's very interesting. Secretary Hagel explicitly agreed that those programs were, quote, luxuries. And that led to the obvious follow-up. Well, if they are luxuries, and money is so scarce, and you are saying we are right now endangering the national security of this country, have you considered eliminating those luxuries before you start forcibly retiring soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines? And I'm sorry to say the answer was no, we haven't considered that. It was a sad admission of the political process of Washington in the Senate Armed Services Committee. I introduced an amendment to say that $7 billion alternative fuel budget should be available if needed to provide for the men and women of our military and provide for our national security needs. Unfortunately, it was voted down on a straight party line, and so the Democratic majority voted that down. We need to have a serious examination of how money is being allocated. We need to be allocating far more money to actually defending this country rather than to bureaucratic overhead, rather than to congressional pork. And we need to look also, I think there's a very good case to be made. The sequestration has begun to cut into the bone, and that we should not be holding military spending hostage to efforts by the administration to jack up non-defense spending.
Republicans will control the committee next year. Senator McCain will presumably be chairman. You'll be in the majority. I mean, do you expect...
And I keep trying to encourage Senator McCain to come out of his shell and express his views.
Yeah, I'm sure he appreciates that. And yes, he needs that a lot, actually. You traveled with him, right, to Halifax for that conference just a couple of weeks ago.
It was just a couple of weeks ago. We had a bipartisan delegation that went up. About 60 nations were in Halifax for a defense conference. We had defense ministers, foreign ministers, heads of state. It was really a terrific conference. And
any particular takeaway? I mean,
you know, what was striking was the unanimity of perspectives among our allies. I mean, we did a number of bilateral meetings in the margins, as is typical at these conferences. And one after the other, our allies would just look at us in astonishment and say, where is America? What has happened? Whatever the challenge was, whether it was standing up to ISIS, whether it was standing up to Iran, whether it was standing up to Russia and Putin's aggressiveness, one after the other of our allies would say, listen, if America doesn't lead, the world is a heck of a lot more dangerous. And it was striking. You could almost hit play, and the same message would come from one ally after another. We need American leadership back in the world.
I suppose one of the first issues that will come up before Senate Armed Services Committee and in the new Congress will be the confirmation of, I guess, I don't know if it's official yet, but everyone expects it to be the nomination of Ash Carter to be Defense Secretary. Do you have a view on A, him personally, and B, on the whole question of the leadership of the Defense Department over the last 6 years and over the 2 years you've been here?
Well, it is not encouraging that in 6 years now, we're now on to our 4th Secretary of Defense. Particularly at a time where the world has gotten more and more dangerous. The fact that this administration has been unable to keep steady leadership at the helm of the Defense Department is not good, and it's even markedly worse. The last 2 Secretaries of Defense took the rather remarkable step of both writing books detailing the political fecklessness of this administration. And what's striking in the 2 accounts is both describes defense policy being driven by political operatives out of the White House and not having a serious focus on the national security interests of this country. And to see 2 defense secretaries write that book, and I don't think anyone would be surprised if in another year a 3rd defense secretary joins that cadre, writing what I would suspect to be a very similar book. That starts to be a pretty consistent pattern. Mr. Carter, I don't know. I look forward to getting to know him. He has a good reputation, and it was disquieting in the process to see several prominent candidates publicly take their name out of contention. I mean, it is not a good thing when serious people are saying, heck no, I don't want to be Secretary of Defense. It starts to suggest the way the administration is treating the Defense Department is not a pattern of behavior that inculcates strong, serious leaders focused on defending this nation, and now we need exactly that. It is my hope that Mr. Carter demonstrates a seriousness of resolve and a willingness to speak the truth, even if that truth may be inconvenient to political operatives in the White House.
You were a critic of Senator Hagel. We'll get on to all these other important issues in a second, but of Senator Hagel when he was nominated. And I'm just curious, what was it like? I mean, then you had oversight responsibilities. I'm sure you dealt with him quite a lot over those 2 years. What was your sense of how he did and how much ability he had to really shape policy as opposed to, as one gathers, being sort of overridden or told what to do by various White House aides?
Well, look, in the process where he's stepping down, I don't know that there's a lot of value to join in piling on. Yeah. And it's not necessarily easy to parse responsibility. By any means, this administration's foreign policy has been a manifest disaster. It has been, if you look across the globe, it is difficult to find a region of the world that is not materially worse in the last 6 years. I mean, you know, it seems the whole world is on fire right now. And there's a reason. The strategy of leading from behind doesn't work. That is a euphemism for not leading, for running away, for withdrawing. And when America recedes from leadership in the world, that creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum, we've seen nations step like Iran, like Russia, like China. And that makes the world much, much more dangerous. And look, Secretary Hagel was certainly part of that team, but as is Secretary Kerry, as was Secretary Clinton. But at the end of the day, you know, as Harry Truman's famously observed, the buck stops here. At the end of the day, it is the president who's the commander-in-chief. It is the president who is responsible for laying out foreign policy. It is the president who's responsible for leading the efforts to defend this country. And for 6 years, we have seen a feckless and ineffective foreign policy, and it's because they're focused on the wrong things. In my view, our foreign policy should focus like a laser on protecting the vital national security interest of the United States. That is the most consistent failing of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, is that it doesn't key off of as its touchstone our national security interest. Instead, it seems to be focused on photo ops and press releases and international law and international norms and almost everything except what is in the vital national security interest of the United States.
I suppose at the same time that you're considering Ash Carter's nomination, the Senate will also be considering the question of Iran sanctions. I mean, there'll be two big foreign policy and defense policy issues right there, front and center early on. Where are you on? They've announced the extension. What should be done? What can or should Congress do? Do you think Congress can actually do something?
I do think Congress can and should lead on Iran sanctions, and I hope that that is very high on our agenda in a new Congress. In my view, the threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capability is the single gravest threat to U.S. national security across the globe. And the policy direction we're following right now is foolhardy and catastrophically reckless. In my view, we are repeating the mistakes of the Clinton administration with respect to North Korea in the 1990s. The 1990s, the United States led the world relaxing sanctions against North Korea. Billions of dollars flowed into North Korea, and they used that money to develop nuclear weapons. We are repeating that same mistake right down to the rather astonishing fact that the Obama administration has recruited the very same person, Wendy Sherman, who led the failed North Korea negotiations under the Clinton administration, to come in and be the lead negotiator with Iran to repeat the same mistakes. And with respect to Iran, I think we can expect the same outcome if we continue on this path, but we can also, the stakes are qualitatively higher. With North Korea, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, they're radical, they're extreme, but they're fundamentally megalomaniacal narcissists, both father and son, which means some degree of rational deterrence is possible. Both father and son understood if they ever actually used a nuclear weapon, that day their regime would end. The danger with Iran, with Khomeini and the mullahs, is when you have leaders that are animated by religious extremism, by an embrace of a fanaticism that welcomes death and glorifies suicide. The ordinary cost-benefit analysis of deterrence doesn't play out the same way. And in my view, the odds are unacceptably high, if Iran ever acquired a nuclear weapon, that it would use that nuclear weapon either in the skies of Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. And if Iran were to use a nuclear weapon over Tel Aviv, it would murder vast numbers of Palestinians. And the danger is that the Iranians would find those perfectly acceptable collateral consequences to further their stated objective of annihilating the nation of Israel. And look, nobody here knows the exact odds of that. You can't place a precise figure on it. It's unacceptably high in any measure. But if that doesn't happen, the alternative, if Iran acquires nuclear weapons capability, is we see a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East. We see the other countries in the Middle East immediately going to get the same capability to counteract it. We see proliferation throughout a region that has never been characterized by stability. We see Iran strengthened as a hegemon in the region, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, using its nuclear power to increase that role. And that, Bill, is the thank God scenario. That's the good outcome. And yet, the administration seems hell-bent on pursuing a foolhardy deal just for the sake of a deal. I think it's extraordinarily dangerous, and it is my hope and belief that the new Senate being sworn in, you will see real leadership from the Senate to prevent a bad deal with Iran.
And I suppose the question then is how many Democrats might join in such an effort? And I mean, you have a reputation, which is well-deserved, as being a strong conservative and willing to fight your own party, as well as obviously the Obama administration, the Democrats, but actually you've worked with Democratic senators on several issues. I remember Senator Schumer on an issue of an Iranian ambassador, and I think Senator Gillibrand on questions of some military questions. Do you think enough Democrats might break with you? The Obama administration has indicated they want nothing,
Yep.
right? And so I'm just curious, as this, what do you expect over the next 2, 3, 4 months in terms of your Democratic colleagues?
I am hopeful and optimistic on that front. I think foreign policy is one area that has particularly ripe opportunities for bipartisan cooperation. In the last 2 years, as you mentioned, I've been involved in a number of different pieces of legislation with Democrats, and we've enjoyed significant success. Actually, have had more legislation pass the Senate as a freshman senator than most of the other senators, and that's as a freshman senator in the minority party. So as you noted, some months ago when Iran named as their ambassador to the UN Hamid Abudulabi, who was a known terrorist, participated in holding Americans hostage in 1979 and 1980. That was intended to be, it was in fact a slap in the face to America. And folks in this town were wringing their hands saying, what can we do to stop it? There's nothing we can do. Well, we introduced legislation to prohibit known terrorists from receiving visas to come into this country and barring Abudulabi from coming in. And it earned support on the floor from senators as varied as Chuck Schumer, Lindsey Graham. When Schumer was praising it on the Senate floor, I went up to him. I said, Chuck, you better be careful. Lightning's going to strike you. It passed the House 100-0. The Senate 100-0. It passed the House 435-0. And President Obama signed it into law. And in fact, a couple weeks later, he was at one of these black tie dinners in Washington where politicians try to be funny. And the president stood up and said, a couple of weeks ago, Ted Cruz introduced legislation, and I just signed it into law. Here's a picture of the signing ceremony. He put up a picture of him, of me, and the devil in hell freezing over. But, there are other examples. For example, Senator Bob Menendez and I together introduced legislation providing for a $5 million reward from the State Department for information leading to the capture of the terrorist who kidnapped and murdered Naftali Frankel, one of the 3 Israeli teenagers who was kidnapped and murdered. Naftali was also a U.S. citizen. That passed the Senate unanimously. When it comes to Iran, for about a year now, we've had a bipartisan supermajority on Kirk Menendez, Iran sanctions legislation. I'm an original co-sponsor of Kirk Menendez. I think Kirk Menendez would have passed many, many months ago, except for one thing. Harry Reid would not allow it to come up for a vote. We had the votes to pass it, and in fact the votes to beat a filibuster, if only it would be allowed to come up for a vote. And the reason it didn't pass is because Harry Reid wouldn't let it happen. I am confident with a Republican majority we'll see a vote on either Kirk Menendez or other legislation focused on Iran sanctions. Now, in my view, Kirk Menendez doesn't go nearly far enough. I joined as an original co-sponsor because I think there's value to having a bipartisan repudiation of the foolhardy path that the administration's on. But the proper approach, in my view, would have a lot more stick and a lot less carrot when you're dealing with a nation like Iran. So I introduced my own Iran sanctions legislation. Kirk Menendez lays out circumstances in the future in which sanctions would be reimposed. The legislation I introduced on my own would immediately reimpose sanctions, would ratchet them up to make them markedly more punitive, and then lays out a clear path that Iran would follow to lift the sanctions. And that path would require Iran to disassemble every one of the 19,000 centrifuges, to hand over all of the enriched uranium, to shut down their ICBM program, which doesn't exist to put satellites in orbit. It exists to deliver weapons of mass destruction and murder Americans or our allies, and cease being the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Now, I think that's actually what a foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran focused on our national security would be directed to. And I would note, with falling oil prices, Iran is all the more vulnerable to sanctions right now. And so I don't know what the new Senate will do, but I do think there's real potential. I think a lot of Democrats in the Senate are uneasy about the path the administration is on with Iran, and I think there's real possibility for bipartisan cooperation there.
And I think some Democrats have expressed unease about the path the administration's on, or the lack of path, perhaps, with respect to Putin and Russia. Isn't that the case? And,
very much so. You know, I'll tell you, it is striking. You look at, I don't think Putin is a complicated man. He is a KGB thug. And he's been quite transparent. He has said candidly, in his view, the greatest geopolitical disaster of modern times is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And in my view, Putin is trying to do everything he can to reassemble as much of the old Soviet Union as possible. And if there's one principle for time immemorial, it is that bullies and tyrants don't respect weakness and don't respect appeasement. Appeasement doesn't work. Now, you look at Ukraine, for example. You know, Ukraine, when Putin invaded Crimea, President Obama said publicly, well, it seems to me his lawyers are telling him something different from what my lawyers are telling me. That is utterly incoherent. This was not a debate between lawyers in a law school faculty lounge.
not that you have anything against lawyers.
I have quite a bit against lawyers, to be fair. But look, it's fundamentally misunderstanding the problem. This wasn't a question of international law. And let's be clear, America undertook a treaty obligation to stand with Ukraine. Ukraine not long ago had the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, and it willingly handed it over. Gave it up, and we said, all right, in exchange for handing over your nukes, we will help defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, I guarantee you, anyone else with nukes across the world, they looked at that and they're saying, I ain't giving up mine. That didn't work out because suddenly when Putin came into Ukraine, Europe and America were made a little noise, but didn't do much of anything. And I'll tell you in terms of Democrats, you know, it's interesting, some of the closed hearings of the Senate Armed Services. Open hearing, you have the reporters there. In the closed hearings, when you're talking about, say, Ukraine, and the administration sends witnesses, it is striking how there is virtually not a single senator on the entire committee who is supportive of what the administration is doing. Those hearings basically consist of 20-some-odd senators saying one after the other, what in earth are you people doing? I mean, look, the Ukrainians, back in May, I visited Ukraine, visited with President Poroshenko. You know, when he came and addressed a joint session of Congress, gave an incredible speech, must have gotten 20 or 30 standing ovations from virtually every member of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate. I think the most powerful line President Poroshenko said is, you cannot fight a war with blankets alone. We appreciate the blankets, but the Ukrainians are defending themselves with hunting rifles against Russian tanks. And this doesn't make any sense. The people of Ukraine, they want to be with the West, they want to be with Europe, they want to be with America. They are fighting to defend their own nation. They're not asking us to put Americans in harm's way. But at a very minimum, we ought to honor our treaty obligations and help provide them with the military aid so they can defend themselves. And the administration's response to this is incoherent.
I'll ask about one more place, and then we can take a few questions. Another country that's not asking for American boots on the ground, obviously, is Israel. Mm-hmm. You've been very critical of the administration's stance towards Israel. Maybe talk a little about that, but also what, again, can Congress do some things in the next year, or is it going to be simply urging the president to change his mind?
Look, I think there is a great deal Congress can and should do with regard to Israel, with regard to all of our allies. I think what we're going to see the next 2 years is a far more assertive Congress with regard to foreign policy, because the failures of this foreign policy are profoundly dangerous. And, you know, when it comes to Israel, I'm sorry to say this is the most hostile administration to Israel we've seen in modern times. And it is manifested over and over and over again. You know, I remember some months back when Israel was facing rocket fire from Hamas, and the FAA banned flights into Israel. Now, when that happened, I went publicly and raised a few questions. I asked, has this administration just launched an economic boycott against the nation of Israel? And I pointed out that the FAA does not ban flights into Pakistan, into Yemen, into Afghanistan. It doesn't indeed ban flights into much of Ukraine, even though Ukraine, you'll recall, had just a couple of months earlier, separatists had used a Buk missile to shoot down a commercial airliner. And yet, into much of Ukraine, flights are allowed. And yet, because one rocket had fallen harmlessly about a mile away from Ben Gurion Airport, one of the safest airports in the world, the FAA had shut down every American flight into Israel. And it had done so at the exact same time that John Kerry arrived in the Middle East with $47 million for Gaza that would end up in the hands of Hamas, while the administration was pressuring the Israeli government to stop acting to take out the rockets and to take out the terror tunnels that were being used against them. Now, there is power, I think, to shining light, to asking questions, because within a few minutes of those questions being raised, the State Department found themselves being asked those same questions repeatedly by members of the press. And shortly thereafter, former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg got on a commercial airliner and flew to Tel Aviv, flying through Europe, which was very beneficial. And the combination of the light and attention made the flight ban indefensible, and within 36 hours, the administration lifted it. You know, listen, we saw just a few weeks ago, Jeffrey Goldberg wrote a piece with some rather stunning revelations from the administration, where you'll recall that the most titillating was an unnamed senior White House advisor referring to Prime Minister Netanyahu with an epithet for poultry manure. Now, that got a lot of noise. You know, in many ways, I actually found that particular news unsurprising, because the treatment of the Israeli government had long demonstrated that was the view of the administration to the Israeli government. They simply said it out loud. The most damning part of that article was not the profane insult. The most damning part of that article was another quote by that same senior advisor saying that they considered it a great victory that they had delayed Israel from acting vis-a-vis Iran so long that they could no longer prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons arsenal. Now, that is a quote from a senior administration official in the White House who thinks it's a good thing that Israel didn't act to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons arsenal. That is extraordinarily dangerous. And I'll mention one final thing on this. The misguided Iran deal not only is dangerous to the national security of this country, but it also has resulted in the administration being almost oblivious to other national security threats. So it's about a year ago that the administration completely failed to perceive the threat, number one, of Putin invading Ukraine, caught him completely by surprise, and likewise completely failed to perceive the threat of ISIS. Indeed, the president famously derided them as the junior varsity. And you know, part of the reason, it's very interesting, it was in January of 2014, Ben Rhodes, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor, told a group of activists that a nuclear deal with Iran was going to be the, quote, Obamacare of the second term. This was going to be their singular accomplishment, a nuclear deal with Iran, and they would be presumably feted in the faculty lounges across the globe. And that is a focus on political objectives, frankly, driven by naivete, driven by a failure to perceive the manifest danger of Iran, but it also resulted in this administration not paying attention to the other threats and being caught completely unawares.
I'm still shuddering at the image of celebrations in faculty lounges across the globe. Somehow I don't think that would be very good for America, but why don't we take a couple of questions, and maybe I could ask people who haven't had a chance to ask, been called on before, to be, I will try to call on you now. It's a little hard to tell. Okay, over here, a couple of people have questions. I think there's a microphone coming. Is it? Yeah.
Thank you. Monji Dawedi from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. Senator, what's your take on what's happening in Tunisia in terms of the Arab Spring and the recent elections and the success of writing a constitution? And would you support more, maybe aggressive or more support to Tunisia in this endeavor as long as it stays in this course, instead of just rhetoric that's coming and Tunisia is doing great, but nothing in terms of real support, especially economically?
Look, I think we need to be focused on standing by governments and leadership that will be allies to America, that will stand with America. You know, in the course of the Arab Spring, one of the things, the so-called Arab Spring, one of the things that was dismaying was seeing the administration eager to stand with, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, toppling Mubarak, who, needless to say, was a flawed leader, and yet had been a pretty consistent ally of America. And by any measure, the Muslim Brotherhood was not. In contrast, when you saw the potential for revolutionary change in Iran, the administration stayed all but silent. When there was an opportunity for the people there to topple a regime that has the greatest anti-American animus, perhaps of any regime on the face of the planet. The focus, I think, should be standing with our allies and preventing radical jihadists from seizing power. And I think that should dictate American foreign policy with regard to nations across the globe.
Another question? Yes, sir, over here.
Ken Timmerman, I'm author of Dark Forces, The Truth About What Happened in Benghazi. A quick question about the Iran negotiations. There's been a lot of concern that the Secretary of State will not submit that agreement to the Senate. How do you propose to force him to do that? And have you looked into the case law, Senator Case of 1972, which does in fact require the Secretary of State to submit all documentation on all agreements, not just treaties, to the United States Senate?
Look, it is a very good question. There was a meeting of congressional leadership with the president shortly after the election where the topic of Iran came up, and the president was asked, will you submit it to the Senate? And he said, oh, well, we'll brief you on it. But their attitude is it's sort of an informational briefing rather than respecting the constitutional authority of the Senate to ratify treaties. And in my view, and this is actually an area where I hope there will be a potential for bipartisan agreement. I think there are both Republicans and Democrats who believe that any deal with Iran needs to go through the Senate, needs to be subject to scrutiny and oversight. And there are a number of conversations ongoing right now about precisely the best mechanism to ensure that happens. I intend to do everything possible to prevent a bad deal with Iran, and one of the key ways of doing so is forcing the administration to seek Senate approval.
Didn't Secretary Kerry say that, reassure, was that before Senate Foreign Relations maybe, or SASC? I can't remember. Probably Foreign Relations, I suppose. That Of course, Congress will have a say on this.
Well, and you know, the Secretary of State would never be for something before he was against it.
Right.
So.
Good point.
Sorry, that was a cheap shot.
No, it's fine. Right here, this young lady, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sharice. I'm with the George Mason chapter of the Alexander Hamilton Society. And I just had a question about America playing a leading role in unmanned aircrafts using drones. Do you think that, like, what is your take on the increasing usage of unmanned aircrafts and the influence this might have on other nations building up their drone programs? And then kind of a second part to that question, do you think that the U.S. should take the lead and push for international policy regarding the use of drones before other nations develop programs similar to ours?
Look, it is a great question, and it's one of the realities of changing warfare. Drones have changed how combat is conducted. It's changed our capacity. There are advantages to that, and there are risks to that. Now, drones, it seems to me, are a tool. They're a tool that clearly can have beneficial impacts, in particular allowing us to project force without risking U.S. soldiers. But there are dangers as well. I am concerned, A, domestically, about the use of drones here at home, and in particular we had fairly lively disagreements with the administration a year ago, asking the very simple question about whether a drone can use force against a U.S. citizen who doesn't pose an imminent threat here at home. And the administration repeatedly, and to my mind, inexplicably, refused to acknowledge that the Constitution prevents the federal government from using a drone against a U.S. citizen at home if he or she doesn't pose an imminent threat. I think that's a real concern. There are civil liberties concerns to American citizens here at home and privacy concerns that trouble me. There are also concerns from the perspective of national security. No administration has used drones as aggressively as has the Obama administration. And I'm worried about what I would call video game warfare. And part of it seems to derive from an ideological and somewhat irrational animus to Guantanamo, to detaining foreign terrorists, and to interrogating them. And I have to say, I find it a curious chain of reasoning that the administration has expressed civil liberties concerns about interrogating foreign terrorists. I don't quite understand the reasoning that says we respect the civil rights of a foreign terrorist so much that we're going to drop a bomb on you from the sky and blow you up instead of apprehending you and interrogating you. I just, look, I got to say, if I were that person, I'd much rather you respect my civil liberties a little less than not bomb me. like that, but yet it's cleaner and more antiseptic, and I worry from a national security perspective just how much intelligence we're losing if someone is in fact a serious terrorist, a terrorist leader. There is significant benefit, if it is possible, to apprehending that individual and interrogating them, finding out who else they're working with, what plans are in place, who their contacts are. And if we're mistaken, and the intelligence can be mistaken, if someone is not a terrorist, then there's real benefit to apprehending them and discovering that. When you send a drone out and just push a button, both of those benefits are lost. And so, yes, I think we need to have a lot more thinking about the proper use of drones as a tool in warfare. I think if you've got a terrorist in a distant location where you can't get soldiers in easily to capture them, and you've got strong intelligence that they are a serious national security threat to the United States, yes, we should use drones to take them out. But I do have real concern about it being seen as so easy that it prevents us from doing the harder work of apprehending the bad guys and preventing future terrorist attacks.
Let me ask a final question, because we want to stay on time. It's been a very unusual conference. It's moved along on schedule, and we have Governor Bobby Jindal, so we want to hear from him at 4. There was a big, the drones reminds me of, and intelligence reminds me of the debate last year over the NSA and all the related programs. Mike Pompeo earlier on pretty much, I say, defended the current programs. You've been more skeptical of them.
Yeah.
How do you think, give us a little bit an argument on that, but also how do you think that works out? I guess there's a midsummer, I think, deadline for reauthorization of the legislation, and where do you think that ends up?
You know, I think it is possible for Congress to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think it is possible for us to respect and protect more than one value. We have a responsibility to protect the national security interest of this country. We also have a responsibility to protect the civil liberties of our citizens. And I believe both are possible. You know, one of the consistent failings of this administration, I think, is they repeatedly have failed to distinguish bad guys from good guys. So to give a couple of examples, you know, when it comes to surveillance, they are sweeping in cell phone metadata. They had been sweeping in email information for law-abiding citizens all across the country. And yet, when you have real live terrorist threats, let's take, for example, Nidal Hasan, a major in the Army communicating over email with a known terrorist, Anwar al-Awlaki, we had the communication back and forth inquiring about the permissibility of jihad. And yet somehow they failed to connect the dots and stop Nidal Hasan from carrying out that act of terrorism. Likewise, the Zarnaf brothers, who committed the Boston bombing. We knew in that instance the Russians had told us that they were radical Islamic terrorists. We'd gone and interviewed them. They went back to Chechnya. And yet, apparently, when the elder brother posted on YouTube, I think it was, a video calling for jihad, we weren't focused on that. And we didn't prevent that bombing. And one of the problems with an administration's approach that is sweeping in every law-abiding citizen is there's so much information, there's too much to distinguish good guys from bad guys. And I think we can maintain tools to protect the national security, to monitor and surveil foreign terrorists abroad, while at the same time, listen, you know, the expansion of Big Brother is always justified as it'll protect your security. And it is a perfectly normal American reaction to say we need to limit government power when it comes to U.S. citizens. That's what the Bill of Rights was all about. And I think we can protect both. And unfortunately, this debate is often framed in black and white terms. You know, you either monitor and surveil everything, or you do nothing and remain blind and can't stop terrorism. And I think that, you know, I'll give an example. I'm right now the ranking member of the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And in that capacity, we put out a series of reports on the lawlessness of this administration. 2 of those reports have focused on cases before the U.S. Supreme Court where the Obama administration has argued for expanded federal power. And boy, this administration likes expanded federal power. 22 cases where it's argued for expanded government power where the U.S. Supreme Court has unanimously rejected it. Not 5-4, not closely divided, but 9-0, including Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan, President Obama's appointees, rejected it. One of them was a case out of Maryland, and this goes to the privacy point, where the Obama Justice Department went before the Supreme Court and argued that law enforcement could place a GPS on any American's car with no probable cause, no articulable suspicion, and the Fourth Amendment said nothing about it. Now that is an astonishing proposition. That ought to scare the heck out of any American citizen, that right now, if you parked out on the street, the government could put a GPS on your car for no reason other than they don't like the color of your tie. And yet the Obama Justice Department stood before the Supreme Court and argued that. Now, thankfully, the Supreme Court unanimously, 9-0, said that is not consistent with our Bill of Rights. The government doesn't have the power to monitor citizens. So I think we can do both, protect both values, and I think we have to do both.
I think we've got the headline from this panel. Ted Cruz praises Congress. You know, can chew, can what is it? Walk and chew gum at the same time. Right, that would be impressive. Thank you very much for joining us, Senator Cruz. And thank you for your leadership on these issues.